Welcome, everyone, to our Framing Projects for Success, the podcast to empower leaders and project managers to transform their vision into reality. My name is Ivona Wilson. I'm your host. I'm a facilitator and consultant, and I've had amazing privilege of working on numerous complex projects, mainly in the oil and gas industry, to help teams bring their ideas to life. I've witnessed the power of effective project framing, the art of setting up projects for success, no matter what the nature of the project. And today, I have another incredible guest with me, a framing facilitator, a man of many trades, Mr. Karl Sanderson. Karl, how are you doing today?
Right. Well, what I do now is not what I did yesterday or even 20 years ago. I've had quite the varied career, but oil and gas has been a big feature of it, and that's where I picked up the opportunity framing. I'll tell you more in a minute. At the moment, I'm an investor and advisor to the energy transition. I guess I've been in the energy sector now for about 20 years. And I got into it through oil and gas, as one typically does, but I spent a considerable part in civil nuclear as well. And now I'm obviously all over the renewables. In the more distant past, and perhaps becoming again true, I've been an entrepreneur. I was an entrepreneur through the big dot-com boom at the turn of the millennium when I was into high tech and communications. And before that, my very first decade was as a management consultant, where I picked up the bare essences of building businesses and managing them and managing things at large scale. I should say in the oil and gas sphere that it was upstream, and my experience is really around the mega project infrastructure deployment space, which is where framing really cut its teeth. And how I got into opportunity framing, well, that was courtesy. Well, I guess it was son of Frank Cook at some point, because I was working for Chevron on one of my early engagements, and I happened quite by accident to be invited by one of Chevron's CSOC champions, as they call them, capital stewardship and organizational capability champions, who normally did opportunity framing, to step in for him while he was doing something else. So I discovered it quite by accident, but I guess he liked the look of me and thought I might understand it and like it, and boy did I like it. And I've been using it ever since. That must have been back in 2000 and 5, and I must have done, well, I couldn't even count the number of frames I've done since then, because as soon as I saw it, I knew it was the best thing since sliced bread. Does that answer your question, Ivona?
Yeah, I mean, we had an interview with Frank few weeks ago. So if you haven't watched it, take a look and see what Frank Cox says about framing. So you got inspired by accidents, sort of accidental leadership, accidental facilitation, which is another big topic. But anyway, from your experiences, Karl, how would you explain in your own words what is opportunity framing workshop? Not sure if you want to talk about opportunity framing as a process or opportunity framing
Yeah.
as a workshop.
Well, it's an answer to a problem. I mean, Chevron, this whole thing that Frank Cook did, and this whole thing that the then CEO of Chevron did with capital stewardship, was an answer to the problem of why are our projects always bottom quartile in terms of delivery of scope, delivery against cost or budget. And as you say in one of your other videos introducing opportunity framing, most projects fail. They fail on one of those dimensions of scope or cost or schedule, or all three of the above and then some. And the mega projects, the very large projects, the billion or tens of billions or hundreds of billions of dollar programs or projects, they're very fragile, and they can fail big time on all three of those axes, and it's very common. And anyone will tell you that and show you the data whether it's Oxford Global Projects here in the UK or IPA Global Inc., Ed Merrow's outfit. They've all got decades worth of data showing just how fragile these things are, just how wrong they go. And for me, opportunity framing is an answer to that project. It stops, if you do it right, and if you have a fair wind and not a black swan, your project won't get recycled. It will deliver the required scope, and it'll come in within time and budget if you do framing right. Of course, you have to do a whole bunch of other things as well. But if you don't do framing, you're pretty much guaranteed to have a train wreck on your hands. In my personal experience, and in the experience and through the data of all those organizations that I mentioned. So that's what opportunity framing is. It's an answer to that problem. But what is it in reality? Well, it's a shaping process. I guess the bread and butter variety is it's a shaping process for individual projects. So when you know what it is that you want to do, like here I have a resource in the ground, whether it's oil and gas or a mineral resource, copper, iron, whatever, something like that, something which has a definable edge, if you like, as a project, hence the word frame, right? You can put it in a box. Then it is a process for the front end loading, if you like, the upfront shaping of that project in a structured manner that makes sure that you don't miss anything out, which so many projects do, and that's why they go on to fail. But it's more than just that process. The way the process is done, and you mentioned the word workshop, it's done in a kind of face-to-face collegiate collaborative style. It's not a document, it's more of an event, it's more of a process. What it does is it achieves stakeholder alignment. Now, for many years, going back to my management consultancy day, I remember one of the very first projects I went on that had failed. It was the London Stock Exchange was trying to migrate to a rolling settlement from fixed account-based settlement way back in the late 80s, early 90s. The reason that project, and that was $1 billion project back then, back in the late 80s. So imagine the size now. It failed because of stakeholder misalignment. There were 400 stakeholders, banks, institutions across the City of London, and they didn't agree on what they wanted out of it. If framing had been available to them, I don't think it would have failed. And Coopers would have kept the job, and Anderson Consulting, which I was working for, wouldn't have got the work. But it's a process around achieving stakeholder alignment. And in terms of its application, I mean, I mentioned, yes, it's applied to projects, but it can also be applied to strategy formulation. It can be applied, and I've personally applied it to government policy formulation, even that, and some niche things like procurement strategy, and so on and so forth. And as you mentioned in your video, once you become a really big fan of it, like the two of us really are, you start applying it in your personal life to which car shall I buy, which schools are my daughter's going to go to, which house will I buy in Florida, as was your case study. You start using the tools just instinctively and automatically to structure the way one makes decisions. Because at the end of the day, it's a decision support tool. It helps you, the reason it helps shape your project is it helps projects which are going through that stage-gated maturation process that big projects go through, that waterfall process. It helps you set yourself up for decision gates. And there are several decision gates. Whatever your methodology is, there's usually 3, 4, maybe 5 decision gates before you even get to a final investment decision and commit the big bucks. And framing is a repeated shaping process that helps you get from gate to gate in a structured manner without messing up, and making sure all the decision makers are aligned so that you get the gate through the gate without any amber or any red flags, of which I've seen way too many in my lifetime.
That's awesome. And that's really good that you mentioned that it's sort of used in that context of stage gate process or waterfall, whichever word you use. Karl, tell us a little bit about your experiences when the client, rings you up and says, hey, I'm looking for some help with my project, whether it's initiative or some big capital project. What are some of those steps that you would typically take to develop and then facilitate? Tell us something that people who are unfamiliar with this process they can have an idea, how long will it take typically from your experiences?
Yeah, so you went over in your own video, which the viewers can watch separately, the actual steps of the process itself, and the steps usually fit into a 2-day workshop. That's what I would typically convene. 2 days, a bunch of stakeholders, including the decision maker, the main decision executive, if you like, or senior responsible officer, whatever you want to call them, in a room, face to face for 2 days, off site, going through the various steps of framing. But that's not the full thing, right? There's a whole bunch of stuff which goes on in advance of that, and a whole bunch of stuff which goes on after that that makes framing successful. So the key to a successful framing event is preparation by the facilitator. I think you alluded and Frank alluded to the notion that opportunity framing is usually, and in my opinion, is always best facilitated by someone from outside the project who has no axe to grind. That's when it's most successful, and it needs to be an experienced framing facilitator. And I would normally, for a major initiative, say a mega project of a few billion or more, expect to spend 2 or 3 months in advance of that 2-day workshop putting it together, starting with the main decision maker, the DE, if you like to call them, decision executive, and the project director / project manager, and working with them with an increasing, putting the layers of the onion, perhaps a few more people, adding them to the process to make sure they knew what to expect, that they knew how to behave, structuring the workshop, because not all framing events are the same. You've got to pick an appropriate location. You've got to pick the right people to be there, right? And that's why it's usually 2 or 3 months, because getting a reasonable number of people together, and we may be talking about 15, 20 people together in a room, and these are busy people, these will be important people, getting that on their calendars is not doable at 2 weeks notice, unless you're in a recycle situation and the proverbial has hit the fan. But normally you need to do that well in advance if you're on an even keel. The other thing one might do in advance, and I like to propose this, is if you're in a situation where you're framing something which is already in existence, and let's face it, that's about 90% of things that we frame. It's a project that's already in a bit of a mess and it needs a bit of a helping hand, and they're retrospectively trying to wrap a frame that they should have done years ago around something which is going a little bit wrong, or even they want to do a pulse check. Better late than never, I would say. It's never too late to do the frame. But if you're in that situation, it's usually worth pre-populating the frame, because by that stage, a lot of the things like the givens aspect of the project, a lot of them will be cast in stone. So you will know a lot of things about the scope, about the givens, about the policy and the business context, and so on. And they may even have a lot of decisions already made because they've been through some stage gates. So there's usually, I like to go into a workshop with a little bit of pre-population, but with a lot of very deliberate and obvious errors there. So it doesn't look like people are critiquing one's work or someone else's work. It's more like a discussion document to get the conversation flowing. Sometimes that works better with a novice group as well. If you've got a group of people who are not familiar with framing, and outside of the very big oil and gas institutions, people are generally unfamiliar with framing, right? I mean, it's taught in places like Chevron that Frank Cook is talking about. So all the terminology, the whole process is familiar to people. But when I brought it to civil nuclear, they'd never seen anything like it before. So there was a process of education you had to go through. And rather than show them a big blank piece of paper, it's like, right, now we're going to tell me what the value drivers are and the decision criteria and the value measures. And I say, what do you mean? I've got no idea what those terms mean. So rather than spend an hour explaining it, you just pre-populate it with some structure, and they get the idea a lot quicker. So I mean, all of this is there's a lot of pre-reading involved. I mean, the kind of pre-reading I might do facilitator for a framing event is the same as one might do for a peer review, when you're going in for a gate review. of a project as it's approaching the gate, I would demand that level of documentation in advance to try and pre-populate the frame. So that's a lot of, I mean, it's 2 to 3 elapsed months of preparation, but that's not 2 to 3 elapsed months of my time. It's probably only 2 or 3 days of my time to really get through that. Then there's the meeting itself, but then there's the wash up. The last thing any facilitator or any project wants to see is a frame that's gathering dust on the shelf. The frame is there to be used, but just as there's usually an education process for the participants in terms of how one produces the frame, there's also an education process in how one uses it. Because for me, the frame and the business case bookend the stage, right? There are a series of decision support documents that go to the decision makers at the gate when a decision is being made, whether it's concept selection or FID or whatever. And the frame is usually done somewhere around the start of the stage or at the end of the previous stage, but basically at the gates. So these are bookends, and you'd expect to find elements of the frame in the business case. In fact, in my opinion, that's what it's for, right? It helps you. It's the kind of the first draft of the business case, and then you do some work and you fill in the details, and then you go back with the answer saying, we've looked at these alternatives and this is the best one, and we picked it because those are the decision criteria you set when you told me what the value drivers were. And they all nod their heads because the people at the gate were the same people who were sitting in the frame. So there's a whole process through the stage as well where support could be offered by the framing to help the project use it to approach the gate and get through the next gate ready for the next framing event. And that, again, it doesn't have to be months of time. It's usually a little bit of advice here and there. But the short answer to your question is the 2-day event has a lot of things going on before it and a lot of things going on after it in the ideal usage of opportunity framing.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think that's really, you hit the nail by saying that it's not just framing report to be the standalone document that matters, but it's actually an input document to other already established critical documents, such as business case, for example. And a lot of my clients will use for their risk register, so they get initial idea about risks and uncertainties as well as opportunities from the framing workshop, which will then be the basis for other processes to kick them off, such as risk management, as I mentioned, and stakeholders identification and basis analysis, which is something driven usually on big mega projects by the corporate affairs. So that's really good. Well, you mentioned something, Karl, which really triggered that question for me. I know we talked about this a little bit when we met, and this is, we met when I saw your video when you were sharing with APM in the UK, the Association of Project Management, your story about framing, but also you mentioned how you brought opportunity framing workshops from the oil and gas industry into the UK Nuclear Decommissioning Authority. So tell us about that. How was that possible? What is it in your sharing? What did they find in you speaking about framing that triggered those decision makers in another industry to get so enthusiastic about the process? So they jump in with both feet and say, yes, come in, Karl, make it happen for us. So tell us a little bit about that story.
Sure. So, I mean, after I'd essentially learned and applied this process across many different operators in oil and gas, it wasn't just Chevron. By the end of the day, I wound up working for the UK government in the civil nuclear sector, which was commissioning a whole bunch of projects, mainly in the decommissioning space rather than the new build space. And these projects were, just like oil and gas projects, complex, highly regulated, highly, trying to contain dangerous inventories. And they were mega projects. Some of them, I mean, the biggest one was 50 billion-ish. So, that's pretty comparable with some of the biggest projects in oil and gas in terms of upstream development. And what I noticed, my first job there was to be the assurance, the head of the assurance. So I reviewed them. I reviewed all of the 50, again, biggest projects. And boy, well, they won't mind me saying so because it's all in the. There was a lot of red flags around them and a lot of amber, and there wasn't a lot of green. And that's all public domain, no secrets there. I mean, and that could be said of all of the UK government's big projects across the board, not just in the civil nuclear estate. You go and look at the Cabinet Office's Infrastructure and Project Authority annual report, and all you see is red lights and projects getting into a mess. And what I saw there, and my second job in the civil nuclear estate, was to go and learn from other industries and share with other industries things that could be learned. Right. So I ended up saying, amongst other things that they could learn, well, opportunity framing is one of them, and it's one of the big ones. So with my hat on of sucking in good learnings to be applied to civil nuclear from other industries, I thought opportunity framing was a big one. So I rolled my sleeves up and I got stuck in, and we adapted for not just the agency I was working for, but along with Ernst & Young, EY, who'd been commissioned to do this for the UK government, we crafted for the UK public sector from oil and gas a process which they could apply across government, which I applied in anger to my own bit. And the IPA went on to pilot in the rest of the government. And I've got papers in the public domain that we published at the WM Symposium describing all of that in gory detail. If anybody wants to go and look, I think it's authored in my name. And it was very successful. I mean, when we applied it to the civil nuclear estate, it was very, very warmly received. I mean, I've retired from there a year ago, so I don't know quite how it's doing now. But when I left, the board were very bubbly about it, and I think that correctly applied and vigorously applied with careful facilitation, I think it would solve the problem over many years, obviously, because 50 projects in flight is a lot of things to fix. But I think that over a period of steady application of 3 or 4 years, I think that would turn that around. And that instead of looking at a whole bunch of red lights, you might be looking at green with a tinge of amber going forward at the stage gates if it was rigorously applied to all of those 50 projects that I looked at in the past.
Yeah, I mean, that's something, which is so important for so many organizations. I had a client lately that that applied framing for the first time. And, we had like a really short time frame to put this together. It was a day. And I underestimated probably the risk of coming in with this very powerful process to teams that were not really ready to understand and fully participate. And again, because they haven't really mandated the process, it's almost like, looking back, I'm not sure how useful that was for this organization, because it's almost like you want to have some examples, you want to try to introduce framing, and then you've got to, as an organization, make a decision. Is this something we want to do rigorously, apply on all complex projects, or just one-off on big mega project, for example. So did you say that the UK government has actually now mandated framing for all projects? Was it something?
They're in the process of deciding that. Actually, when I introduced framing to my authority, my little bit of the government there, I actually did a frame for the project to introduce framing to the government. And of course, as one thinks about all the possibilities during framing, there was a decision in the strategy table for me to make about whether it should be mandatory or not. And if it was mandatory, then what was it mandatory for? Because there are options. Is it complexity? Is it size? Is it something else? So those are those are the kind of things which, as you're introducing opportunity framing into an organization or a new industry, you can adapt and twist. You can change the terminology. You mentioned earlier that there are terminological differences, so usually you have to bend. I had to bend and shape the oil and gases industry to match His Majesty's Treasury's Green Book, which describes the correct terminology that one puts in business cases for this, that, and the other. So you adapt things like that. And sometimes you have to bend things a little bit out of shape because it's not just a different name for the same thing. It's a slightly different thing. So there are things like that. You always have to adapt. And that's why opportunity framing is best conducted by a facilitator, not just because it's actually a hard thing to do. It's a very skilled job facilitating this kind of thing, but also one has to adapt to the situation. And somebody young and inexperienced is going to fall on their face doing things like that.
Yeah.
Can I give you an example, actually, of applying framing to an audience that's not familiar with it, and the power of it? There was one particular project which I was asked to frame rather late in the day, just after it had been through a decision gate. And this is the decision gate where one shortlists alternatives. So it's the stage, call it appraisal if you like, where you've examined a long list and you are presenting a short list of options. Now, this particular project, which shall remain nameless, had just been through that decision gate, and it had been through many layers of approval. And when I say many, I mean about half a dozen different layers, not just of board level approvals, but governmental approvals. And when it came out the other side, I was asked to frame it. It was in flight. Okay, so I did that pre-population thing that I was talking about, and I took from all of the signed, published, authorized documents that were presented at the gate, all of the things that looked like they were speaking about elements of the frame. And I pre-populated the frame ready for the workshop. Two things I learned. One is only half of it was there. So half of the frame was simply missing. They'd signed this thing off, even though there was X, Y, and Z deliverables that just weren't there in any shape or form. And the other thing was, what was there was mostly wrong, because I sat through that framing meeting and boy, did those guys argue. Even on something as simple as what is the scope. I put up a scope. This is what your document says. This is the scope. That's not the scope. That's out of scope. No, it's not. This is it. 3 hours on the scope section of a project which had just got sanctioned. I mean, absolutely nuts. So what that taught me is that most project managers think they're doing framing, even if they call it something else. Oh yeah, I do all of that. It's all there. It's all in the decision. So, well, it isn't. You're not doing it. You don't know how to do it. You do not know what you're missing. So it's very important in terms of a framing facilitator and what their role is to essentially, without putting it in these terms, but really perform the role of the DE, the decision executive, the decision maker, and perform the role, not speak for them, but just make sure during this whole framing process that they're complete. It's like a process of education, which is why when you speak to people like me and speak to people like Frank Cook, it takes people of our kind of vintage to be able to facilitate opportunity framing. This is not something you just take out of university. You say, go read the opportunity framing guide and then go in there with your workshop facilitation skills, which is generic, and go and facilitate this workshop. No, you have to be able to put yourself into the mind of the DE, the PM, know the kind of thing they're up against because you've been there on a leadership team of that kind of project, of that kind of complexity of scale, and be able to advise them. The opportunity framing is almost like a structured piece of management consultancy advice being delivered. But that's not, obviously, not how we market it, because that sounds a bit too interfering. But it is at that kind of level, and it has that kind of power. It's their words shaped by us into a comprehensible and communicable package among all of the stakeholders in a way that generates all that stakeholder alignment that they probably didn't, or demonstrably didn't, in the case study I just told you about, demonstrably didn't achieve.
That's interesting. That's interesting. So this is interesting. So it's not just about facilitation. It's not just about being able to understand the context and the different elements of the project, so you actually know what they're talking about, or you can ask the right question to understand where they add, but also being able to put yourself in those different shoes of different people. So then the content of the conversation can be understood by different players, especially those decision makers or decision executives that are not necessarily always participating, especially not in those tactical framing workshops when you get to create the roadmap. So from your experiences of being someone who done a lot of work in the oil and gas industry as well as the nuclear industry, and I know, Karl, you've also trained a lot of people just like Frank, from your perspective, what makes framing really successful?
What makes it successful? It's not about the process. Everybody's got a process. I've seen half a dozen, maybe a dozen different processes myself. They use different terminologies, different things from the shopping list of tools you might use, different ways of recording it. That's not what's important. I agree with Frank. He spent a lot of time in his interview talking about giving war stories about bad facilitators. So the answer to your question is, what makes a good frame is good facilitation. And that's actually what's in pretty poor short supply. I've seen some shocking things in my time. I went on one project in the North Sea. It was an oil and gas project in the North Sea. And a guy, you should have seen the look on his face, the project manager, this consultancy, this boutique, did this frame for it. I don't know what to do with it. I don't understand it. Show it to me. So I brought out the strategy table. I kid you not, it was an A1 piece of paper. Just to explain that, it's like this big, right? And it was covered in crap, columns all over the place. There was just no way that anybody was going to understand. It wasn't an options table. It wasn't a strategy table. It was useless, right? And this would be in a boutique applying a process with a facilitator that just didn't know what they were doing. So I think the answer, the big answer, is facilitation. If you want a good opportunity framing, you have to have someone who's probably done 20, 30, 40, 50 frames before, and who's done it across industries, across different kind of, is it a project of this kind, that kind? Is it a policy? Is it strategy? Is it procurement? To have that depth of experience, to have worked at that C-suite level, to have worked at the director level. That's one side of it, good facilitators. But the other side of it, what makes for successful framing, is having a good facilitator only gets you a successful frame. And what that means is it's a good document. And it's a document that is in people's heads, right? So it's both intrinsic in that everybody in the room walks out aligned, but it's also extrinsic in the fact that it's written down and it can be shared. But that doesn't mean it's going to be used. You need to have a project team which understands what they're going to do with the frame. And to allude to something I said earlier, the main thing you do with the frame, other than use it to guide your work during the stage, which is the most obvious use, is you use it in the business case. So the minute you have a frame, you can begin to draft sections of the business case that will be presented maybe in 18 months to 2 years' time at the end of the stage, but you can already begin to draft it. You can already begin to say in it things like, well, you can have a section saying how I looked at that option and I looked at that option. If you have the short list of 3, if you've come out of that long listing stage, and you can already start to populate those sections. I mean, how many business cases have you seen? Everybody who's watching this video, will know of cases where they've seen a business case and you're at this concept selection stage, right, where you're supposed to be choosing one option from the short list that you consider. How many times have you seen one option in the business case? Like 99% of times, right? Because the project team didn't use the frame or didn't do framing and didn't look at all of those options, didn't work them, and they just went in with the one they wanted. And that was what they're, so it's not just about having a good frame. It's about knowing how to use it and to see in the business case elements of the frame reflected. If you do that, if you do those two things and use the frame to guide you from one end of the stage to the other, and you've involved decision makers from that decision gate 2 years in advance to formulate the frame, you'll go past that gate with green lights. You won't get recycled. You won't have messed up your scope, and you'll be on time and budget.
Yeah, and I wouldn't agree more with what you said. Having worked for a large energy producer in Australia for 12 years as the in-house framing and facilitator, I could see that it really needs to be embedded inside the management system, so that the organization really understands what happens after the workshop is complete. And obviously you're in that very confidential space where a lot of consultants really struggle to get in because of the nature of the phase of the project. This is the super confidential phase. But I think ultimately organizations need to sort of build the internal capabilities and to to understand how we're going to do a frame update, for example. And if we're doing frame update, are we doing at the beginning of the phase? We're doing at the end of the phase. And then obviously we want to see the continuation. So if we do an audit, we begin to see how those decisions made early on have been implemented inside the project. So we don't talk at FID, what are the value drivers? Right? I mean, we can do a checkup. Are we still on the same page? Is this really where the value is coming from? Let's look at our project execution plan. And by the way, let's just double check. Is this what we said early on inside the frame? Right? But we don't start this conversation for the first time, like like some projects do, just because they would employ the project manager when they have the scope defined and they're trying to do framing. But as you know, it's already far too late. Once you have a scope defined, you're not looking at value enhancement practices because they wouldn't make huge difference, or they would just be very expensive because you then have to go through change management processes.
I would like to come back to what I said about it's never too late to do framing. I think there is one point where it is too late. If you're doing framing after the final investment decision and you've started to dig holes, pour concrete and cut steel, it really is too late. I mean, that famous eagle's beak diagram, which a colleague of Frank Cook's first drew back at Chevron, and it's come back in various forms. IPA Global have their version. I did my own version in my paper, but it's always the same. That process of adding value, it's as long as you're still in front end loading, it's not too late to do framing. I mean, I've framed projects that have been beyond single concept selection and perhaps 12 to 18 months away from FID. So you're still in that early stage where you've only spent 10 to 15% of the money. It's never too late to add some value by doing some framing, even for a project that late, that mature already. I mean, you won't get all the value, not without recycling it, because you'll probably discover as a result of framing that, well, maybe you should have done this other option. Well, it's too late for that now. I'm just going to have to go with this one because we'll lose too much value by recycling at this stage. But, it's always a good thing to do, and you shouldn't be shy. Of course, the ideal time to do framing is right at the start, when all you've done, in fact, you may not even have appointed your project manager yet. But I have to say, of all of the frames I've ever done in my life, I could count on just one hand the number of things that I've framed that have been at that early stage. most of them have been kind of retrospective in terms of, I know we should have done this. Maybe it would be a good idea to get one in the bag now because it's not quite too late yet. It's mostly like that. And I would still recommend doing that.
No, that's really good. And for those of you who really are project managers outside of the oil and gas industry or nuclear or mining, the project life cycle is slightly different. So I think the point of bringing up the front end loading is to sort of make sure that before the project is sanctioned, before you start your execution phase, that's the perfect time to do frame, whether it's a frame update or frame recreation of the initial frame. Karl, you said something which is absolutely fundamental, why we frame, which is all about creating that stakeholders alignment, so we can all understand what problem we're trying to solve, how important that is, what is the solution. So from your experiences, imagine you are right at the start. This is just a fresh new opportunity. How do you involve stakeholders at different level? How do you bring those decision makers and then project teams, maybe other decision makers, into the process of framing? Whether it's a nuclear or oil and gas, I'm not sure if that would be the same process or different. What are your experiences?
No, it's pretty much the same process. I mean, in that 2 to 3 months in advance of a framing workshop, that is your time to be speaking with, and there usually is in any industry, a main decision maker, the guy who's got the decision authority for the project. And there's usually somebody, usually a single neck. You're in trouble if there are two necks. A single neck who's on the hook for delivery. Call them a project director, program director, whatever, project manager. So you will work with them to identify who the stakeholders are. And that's quite a long conversation, because the stakeholders will be people within the embryonic project team if it's already in flight. There will be stakeholders across the organization. For every project that's in development, there's someone in operations who's going to be on the receiving end, right? There's always a geographic element. If you're doing a project in a particular jurisdiction, there's a country manager. In oil and gas, there are joint venture partners. When you're spending 10, 20 billion dollars on that kind of development, you usually don't just do it on your own. I know Chevron did some in Australia on their own, but usually you're doing it with ExxonMobil or Shell or BP or whatever. So there are joint venture partners you've got to get on board. And then there's this whole blizzard of external stakeholders, right? There's always the government and the various Minister of Mines or Minister of Oil and Gas who's involved. So there's this whole series, and the regulators, of course, whole series of stakeholders. Now, usually you don't get all of those stakeholders in one room on the actual framing event. So in my experience with that kind of mega project, you usually frame in 2 stages. There will be a 2-day workshop, which will be, if you like, the operator team, the owner team, if you want to use that expression, and their cloud of stakeholders, which may be 15 or 20 people. That's usually around the right number to cover the bases, and it's probably not a number you want to go above in order to manage a room in terms of facilitating a framing event. So it's usually a good number. But then there's usually a second stage. I sometimes used to call this a frame check, where you'd have a frame that had been developed by the operator, and then you have another framing event, possibly another 2 days with exactly the same structure, and you just go through and you check with the other stakeholders whether they've got anything to add or anything they'd like to change, right? So, for example, if you might do that with your joint venture partners and with the regulator and with some of the government and some other external stakeholders in the room, right? like the national oil company, who may be one of the joint venture partners. So you might do the framing event of 2 days twice, and that usually goes through the stakeholders. By that stage, you've usually exposed about 40 people to the frame, and those had better be the same 40 people, give or take retirements and natural recycling and whatever, the same people, the same roles, who are going to be involved in signing off the business case when this thing gets to the end of its next stage and is looking for a decision, not an FID decision necessarily, but whatever the next stage gate is. So identifying the stakeholders in that sense is a process of discovery, which you go through putting layers on the onion over a period of time, and it's quite a slow process, because often you have to, I mean, if you pick 40 random people from all of these different organizations, even if Chevron's the operator, half of them won't know what framing is, or won't know what your version of framing is. So they all need to be brought on board. This is what we're doing. This is why we're doing it. This is your role in it. This is how to behave when you come to the event. So that's why it takes a lot of preparation and a lot of time to even get them in the room so that you get a successful event. The last thing you want is what Frank Cook was describing, that facilitator who got the guy who just wouldn't shut up. And Frank had to get up and say, shut up, sit down. That situation. I mean, by careful preparation by the facilitator, you avoid being at that situation, so you don't need to call in the bad cop.
Yeah. Well, this is interesting, and I can see there are different differences I see between my clients in Australia, for example, and some of my clients in the US. I've not done framing in the UK. But I see a lot, like the larger organization in the US, the more hierarchy, which actually I see is the other way around, where you do have some dominant and vocal people, but what you also have is that dead silence where where actually the moment the senior manager comes into the room, like it changes the whole dynamic of the room. And I could not believe what I saw, which hasn't happened in many other countries where I worked. And it's sort of interesting because it kind of shows the culture that, especially for those teams that for the first time have been exposed to facilitation. And that's not the usual way for them to make decisions through brainstorming and participation. So that is the change. And obviously, they're so mindful so that then they just don't speak up. How do you manage that? Is that something that you came across with some of your clients? Like, how do you bring up those quiet voices that may not even be quiet outside of the workshop, but somehow when they exposed to those different vice presidents sitting in a room, they might become very quiet for some reason. So how do you deal with this?
Pre-population's part of it, right? I mean, Frank was describing how he spent half an hour with the participants before going into the room. I mean, you can do that, but the other way of doing it, because the senior people don't write reports, the junior people do, or the middle management. So when you do what I do in terms of process of pre-population of the frame, and you're reading through all the documents, you find all these little snippets of things that people have said that they believe strongly enough to write down on a version control piece of paper, and those find their way into the documents, right? So the thought, even if the person doesn't speak up, you found a way of getting it into the room. And then you can usually find them in the room. I mean, a good facilitator will work the room, as Frank was describing, and bring out the voices. And a good facilitator will have given the senior people in the room a good talking to in advance as well, to make sure that they don't crush the people who are in there. I mean, that's all part of, you don't just go into a framing event and say, and in the first minute, it's not, okay, right, let's start with the business context, right? Somebody tell me what the I mean, there's a whole 1 or 2 hour warm up, right? It's the Karl show or the Frank show, where you're getting everybody in the room comfortable with what the process is. There's a grounding presentation, and I usually let someone fairly middling do that, and then there's a whole, for me, behavioral piece. I tell people how I expect them to behave in the room. I expect them not to dominate. I expect them to give way, to shut up occasionally and so on, and not be quiet, right? Plus, there's also, more subtle techniques like the use of yellow stickies, when you're brainstorming, and rather than have everybody just shout it out at you, if there is a brainstorming section, and there is here and there, you don't just, the yellow stickers allows people to, right, and then you can pick whoever's yellow stickies you like, and you can't recognize from the handwriting who's senior, who's not. All you can see is whether it's a good idea or not, and you verbalize it for them. So there's 100 different techniques. I don't think that these are framing techniques specifically. These are just generic workshop facilitation techniques. Every opportunity framing facilitator needs to have 3 skill sets. They need to be good at workshop facilitation to solve these cultural issues. They need to know about opportunity framing. They need to know what the process is and what it's for. Yes. And they need that third skill, which is being, having been there and done that, having been in the PM and the DE shoes, and thinking ahead for them what they're going to need during the stage, or what they're going to need at the end of the stage, right? And helping them out and advising them. Those are the 3 facilitator skill sets. And the kind of workshop facilitation side of it's the easy bit, if you like, I think.
Okay, so you actually answered the question about what makes a good framing facilitator, and I wouldn't agree more. This is just perfect what you just broke down into this level of details. I do add that it's really useful for framing facilitators to understand the stage gate process, so they can also get into helping the team to develop the roadmap, and also help them to understand if they have to combine phases, for example. What's the impact of combining phases? What would that look like in terms of the actual implementation plan, which means how would I go around deliverables, assurance reviews, activities, or even decisions or decision hierarchy. Would you agree with me?
I think you've made an important point there, and it goes to the heart of what Frank was saying about some organizations just won't get it, and some people won't get it, opportunity framing, because opportunity framing is very linked to this process that some people call optioneering, some people call decisioneering, but in essence is described by that front-end loading equals beak diagram that you showed and that Chevron first drew. The idea that any project or any decision, never mind project, any decision goes through some discrete stages. First stage, where you are examining all the alternatives and screening some of them out and ending up with a shortlist. A second stage, where you take the shortlist and you honestly work all of the alternatives on the shortlist in parallel through to a point where you pick just one, the best one at the end of the stage, or you allow the decision makers to pick one, you recommend one. And then that third stage, where you refine that and answer all the remaining questions and package it up ready for FID, or whatever, package it up for final decision if it's not a project. So every decision goes through that kind of widening process, broadening process of divergent thinking, and then a narrowing process of convergent thinking towards a single concept and a very precise, single, stable, executable scope. Now, some people just don't get that. You and I get that, because oil and gas have been doing this for years. This stage-gated process, as we call it, this waterfall process, as we call it, is in our blood. It's in our DNA. And in the UK government, to give the UK government credit, it's in their blood as well, because it's laid out in black and white in the Green Book, as it were. As this is how one matures any project, any decision, any initiative, whatever it is, whether it's procurement, defense, or, nuclear, a hospital, a prison. These are the stages you go through. Framing fits that process. But if you don't get that process, if that's not what you do, if that's not how you think, then you won't understand framing. And it is unfortunate that just as about 80%, 70 to 80% of projects fail, I mean, the audience is not going to love me for saying this because it's probably going to be an audience of project managers, but 70% of project managers aren't project managers and they don't get it. They're engineers or they're geologists, if you're talking oil and gas, who've had a label of project manager stuck on them when they get to a certain level of seniority and they don't know one end of a stage-gated process from another unless they've been in an organization like Chevron where they've been taught it. And they've been taught it very, very carefully, and they're constantly tested on it and tested on their behaviors that are in accordance with it, right? Some are better than others. But in your generic company that you might go to, another company from outside of oil and gas or defense or nuclear or the big construction, engineering construction initiatives, you won't find that level of thinking. What you'll find is a project manager who says something like, oh, yeah, I just built a train line. And I'll tell you what, it was so fantastic. The next train line, I'm going to build it exactly the same because I've built one train line in my life. And the next one, I know it's going to be successful because I've done it before, right? So they already know the sorting answer. Now that is 70% of project managers around the world. They're the ones that produce those 70% of train wrecks because they don't know this divergent thinking, narrow thinking, and so on. Now, there is another thing about project managers, and this is a recognized phenomenon, and this is that there are even the good project managers. There are two types. There's the type that just wants to get on and execute. And they're very uncomfortable with front-end loading. They're very uncomfortable with divergent thinking. They're great at execution. They're great at convergent thinking and digging holes, pouring concrete, cutting steel, bidding out contracts. They love it. And the other side, who really love I wonder if we could do it this way. Or maybe we could do that. Right? They're the divergent thing. And usually these project managers, like oil and water, some organizations, BP used to do this. I don't know whether they still do it, but they used to separate their pools of project managers into these two things. And their stage-gated process even recognized it's going to be one type of PM up to halfway through concept selection, I think it was. And then we'll switch and we'll bring in the other guy because we want a guy who's comfortable with divergent thinking. And then we're going to swap him out for the other person. And this is all down to Myers-Briggs personality types at the end of the day. You bring in the other type and then he'll close it down and he'll get all of that and he'll try and stabilize the scope, which is what you need to do, and so on. So, those execution types of guys, they typically won't get it, right? If one of those is mistakenly stuck on the front end of the project, you'll have a hard time having them as your partner in framing for them. So this is why a lot of companies fail. They don't really get the whole idea of project management, and they don't map the people properly to this stage-gated process that we know really works. Now, if you put opportunity framing together with the stage-gated process and you get the right type of people, it will work. But you get one thing wrong and the whole thing collapses like a pack of cards, as Ed Merrow's work very vividly demonstrates.
Yeah, and it's exactly what I saw from my experiences working with the oil and gas industry. And I talk about it in my online courses where the front end loading is led by development managers, because that's where you develop your opportunity. And only when you go to the end of concept definition, when you've defined your selected concept, the opportunity becomes a project and you hand it over to the project function. And then it's led by a project manager who puts the hat to get things done as soon as possible by applying project management practices. And again, if you are from outside of the oil and gas industry or mining or nuclear, you'll see that really project managers are trained by Project Management Institute, doing the examination, gaining the accreditation. They really train to be that person who is managing cost, schedule, and quality, and is driving the execution. That if anyone would take anything from the oil and gas industry, apart from opportunity framing workshop, is really our approach to opportunity and project life cycle, which is, you use the stage gate process and you scale it. So it's not something rigid. You make it work for your project, considering the context of the project and your organization to kind of make it work. And a lot of my clients recently telling me they use agile methods, but the decision makers still want to have the stage gate process. And because they don't understand how stage gate process work, it causes that clash between them. And you could kind of say that opportunity framing, it's like an agile practice.
I mean, I tend to think of the agile process as quite iterative and, often wandering away from where you thought it was originally going. But I tend to think of the waterfall process more as a funnel that starts this wide and then gradually narrows. But I think the thing that they do have in common is that they're iterative in the sense that the frame that one does at the start, there are certain elements of it that stay stable, but there are certain elements which are completely different for each stage. I mean, for example, essentially the frame is not, it is a frame for the whole project, but it's really, in terms of the how do we get there piece, the how do we get there describes how you're going to get to the next stage gate. It doesn't describe how you're going to do the whole project, because you don't know what concept you're going to pick yet. So how can you describe the whole project? So the frame, any one version of the frame only gets you to the next gate, and then you do it again. That's why we were talking earlier about you do the frame either just as you approach the gate or just after the gate, but you do it again. And it's not because you got it wrong the first time, it's because you need a new frame to tell the project how it's going to get to the end of the next stage, and then you do the frame again. So, you typically have a minimum of 3 on a project in equilibrium, perhaps 4 frames, depending on how your stage gates are laid out, to get you from inception through to a final investment decision. So in that sense, it's iterative in the way that the agile method is iterative. But I think I'd like to think that the scope slide element of the frame for a $50 billion mega project will be a lot more stable and unchanging than the scope slide, if there is one, for an agile project, which is usually pretty unstable.
Yeah, that's true. Well, I've just got the last couple of questions for you, Karl. I mean, I wanted to ask you about common challenges that you've encountered, but how about the worst disaster that you've ever had? Maybe
Worst disaster.
the biggest disaster during the framing workshop. What happened?
Oof.
And then what did you do about it? What did you learn from it?
It's not so much a disaster. I mean, framing doesn't go wrong in the sense that it does harm if it's done well, but you don't always get to the end of the workshop. And that usually happens in situations where you're trying to frame retrospectively a project that's in flight. So there was one example where it was clear that you weren't very far through. You were going through the givens. You were trying to describe where we are, and you were trying to list givens for this nameless project. And it was clear that some people in the room were adamant that something was a given and others were not. So it was clear that the scope of the project could not be agreed in that format. So we basically had to stop the framing event, and we had to go away and do some work, some considerable work, and then come back to the framing event much later when basically something else had been done. So, but I would describe that not as a disaster, but it's unexpected sometimes and perhaps undesirable, but you're discovering something. When you get into that situation, you discover something that's irreconcilable, some misalignment that cannot be worked out. You're in a situation where you're trying to do a project, but there is a dependency for another project that hasn't been done yet, which is unresolved. Right. So that's the kind of thing. I mean, just to broaden this out, framing doesn't just need, it can be applied to more things than just individual projects. You can apply it to portfolios of projects. I remember there was one country's sector of the North Sea where they had projects out of sequence. So a hub and spoke model. There was a hub in the middle of the sector, and they were developing maturing projects for satellites. So they got themselves into a situation where they spent a whole bunch of money maturing to FID a satellite, which was going to connect back to a hub. But the project that was going to decide what to do with the hub hadn't even started yet, because I was just about to start framing it. And one of the options on the table was decommission the hub. So how could you possibly FID the satellite if one of the options is the hub's not going to be there? So, you know, that particular company had got all of its decisions in the wrong order, and framing individual projects wasn't going to fix that. So the way we fixed it is we framed the portfolio, which was an interesting use for framing, because usually you're doing a stage gated process on an individual project, but there we framed the whole strategy for that sector of the North Sea and the decisions that need to be made on each of the asset pieces of infrastructure within the sector. And in particular, once we'd got the strategy table out, the decision sequence in which those decisions need to be made. So it essentially laid out a 10-year, 20-year plan for the sector. That was an interesting. So again, I'm not describing train wrecks of framing where it's gone badly wrong, except that one I referred to earlier that wasn't done by me, the useless frame, which nobody could understand. But yeah, framing can often uncover uncomfortable truths that management just didn't know. That's a value add right there, even though it's in a way a negative thing for the people concerned.
Yeah, I mean, I can recall very similar example where the whole area of the plant were going through upgrade, and different clients will come to me for framing for individual parts, until there was a light bulb when we realized, you know, those little projects are so tiny compared to what we're actually trying to achieve as a plant. So we then created a frame for the whole portfolio, because so many elements would have been the same, you know, such as value drivers, the overall vision, the opportunity statement will only be slightly tailored. The stakeholders piece was very similar. So then the client will walk away, and then we just create their own schedule for each individual project to really understand how they need to fit together because of so many dependencies. So if this one, for example, needs to start, you know, in March 2024, what are the other projects that need to start beforehand, to make sure that we can start on time, and then how those givens and assumptions can play out. And therefore, you know, how can we best allocate our resources, our people, and our funding to all of those projects? Which one really need to start now? Which one really can be pushed later? And ultimately, you see how you bring value when decision makers can make more informed decisions about allocation of the resources. Yeah, you can.
It's interesting you mentioned dependencies, because I have my own particular flavor of how I do framing and the elements that comprise framing. And I remember when I started out, in terms of what I was taught to do, if you like, by people who'd given me framing tools, dependencies weren't in there. in terms of being fleshed out. But I did find over the years, as you're just describing, that things like that were of utility, and that framing was the ideal opportunity actually to flesh them out. So my views on framing have evolved over the years, and if people want to look at my publications on the subject, papers on the subject, they'll see what in the final analysis I've discarded. Like, I never found a use for SWOT analysis, so you'll never find me doing one of those. But dependencies was never in there, and decision sequencing, interestingly, was hardly ever in there. And I thought that was immensely valuable to quite a few of my recipients. So I've added things and subtracted things over the years. But, you know, while you were talking, I did think of one thing I did wrong once in a framing event, a bit of a mea culpa. So I'll put it out there. It is an example of how framing, well, I'll give you the example. It was a deep water offshore project, should remain nameless. The particular deep water block had an oil deposit which was a little bit at the edge of economic viability. It was small, right? Consider deep water is expensive, as we know. So it was always going to be on the edge of doable in terms of economic value, internal rate of return hurdles, and all the rest of it. And during framing of this project, when we were going through the givens, I remember asking the question, as one does when one's trying to set the frame, is it this wide or is it this wide? Asking the question, is it a given that this project is going to be developed on the basis of the resources within the block alone? Or would you consider partnering, joint venturing with stranded assets, which is what this one might have become, in neighboring blocks? And there were quite a few nearby, right? So, you know, some other European operators, there's quite a few, had some stranded assets which they weren't developing right at the edge of their blocks, quite close to this thing. And I remember the country manager at the time saying, no, absolutely not. We're not going to go there. It's a given that this project is going to be developed on the basis of and we're not going to do any JVs with these other blocks. Years later, when this project was cancelled because the oil price crashed and it became economically unviable, the only option that was left on the table was precisely the one that the country manager had ruled out. And I reflected on what I could have done as a facilitator all those years earlier and challenged the organization. And he was the most senior person in the room, right? And I accepted that as a given. And I shouldn't. I should have pushed back on that. And perhaps, you know, if we had, you know, again, you can't always beat yourself up. I mean, projects fail for all sorts of reasons. But I was just thinking of one thing that I could have done differently in a framing event that might have made the project actually fly. And it's such a small thing. You know, 5 minutes passes and you accept a given and you write it on the slide and everyone moves on and no one ever challenges it because that's a given. We're not going to go there. It's been decided, and it kills the project. Such a fragile thing, like I say, mega projects, and such an important role for the facilitator to get it right.
Yeah,
people in the room.
I would love to do some framing with you, Karl, because I think we have probably a little different style. So it would be a great learning experience. For example, you know, you just made me think about the question that you ask. And if it relates to the option, then this is interesting that you ask that question, you know, as a given. Why did you ask that question? Very, very particular, specific question when you were asking them for given. So are options a given?
Well, I mean, for the listeners, just for the benefit of the listeners, a given is something, a decision that's already been made, right? If you like, it's either a fact on the ground, like the laws of physics, the laws of nature, or it's a decision that's already been made by the company in question, by the project or whatever. So a given, when you go through a phase gate, the given, you expand your list of givens because the decisions you just made in the stage gate, like I selected this concept, okay, that's now a given. And it had been subject to a piece of work. They had looked at this thing about partnering with neighbors, and I guess I just took it as read that a piece of work had been done, it had been looked at, it had been decided that it wasn't going to happen for whatever reasons. And maybe those reasons were valid. Maybe they were valid and there was no way around it. It was actually always going to be a given, no matter how hard I challenge it. But I do remember that at the end of the day, having made that decision is what killed the project, ultimately, even though that decision may have been made many years prior.
Well, thank you for sharing that, and I hope you'll let that go. And I'm sure that wasn't the only factor. And I'm pretty sure. I mean, you were not the only person that were in the room, and I think facilitators tend to be really hard on themselves. And I think what was really amazing that you did ask the question, and ultimately we need to understand and remember about the role that we have in the room. And it looks like you did ask the right question, and you can only do with the group based on what they're ready to do. And I recall plenty of examples where the team wasn't ready to actually do definition of success because the key people in the room have left the workshop without even telling me. Like, would you imagine we started the workshop 5 minutes before moving to the vision? They stood up and they say, "Yvonne, are we going on a plane to Europe?" And I'm like, "What?" And then I said, "I was my early years of doing framing and the team." And I said, "Okay, well, we're moving into what are we actually trying to achieve?" And the people who remain in the room, they refused to define the future because they say it doesn't matter if the key people are left. It doesn't matter what we're here to create, Ivona. They didn't have the belief and they didn't feel like they have the permission to stay and continue with the vision. And, and I think I was fighting a little bit, as a very determined facilitator, I was looking for reason.
We beat ourselves up, but at the end of the day, the facilitator is an external agent there to record the views of the people in the room. At the end of the day, it isn't our project. It isn't our decision. Those givens, and the one I was picking apart there, were not our givens, right? The people who are accountable for those things are the people in the room. But I do feel that because the facilitator is not just a facilitator, they're there to advise, that perhaps a bit more challenge here and there to the decision makers can make the difference between success and failure. But you're right, we are just a facilitator at the end of the day, and the decision and the risks are theirs to measure and balance.
Perfect. That's great. And thank you so much for sharing so many examples and including your pitfalls and challenges and what actually makes a good framing. The final question I have for you, really looking at the changes in the world and maybe the emphasis on AI and other tools. From your perspective, what are some of those emerging trends that we might see in opportunity framing?
So opportunity framing, if you think about its history, invented, I suppose, in the 70s in big pharma, sucked into oil and gas, turned into something by the likes of Frank Cook and others, and really in the last 30 years plowed deep furrows in big complicated engineering construction. It moved into defense. I think what I was trying to do was succeeding in doing, I think, in the last few years, was sucking it into the public sector. As we all know, as long-suffering taxpayers, government projects are rubbish. They're immensely wasteful of taxpayers' money, much more so than the private sector. So I do think that there's an emerging trend of applying to government sector, which spends about 40% of our money in the West on average, applying to that the kind of rigorous processes we have applied for decades in the private sector, we could all do ourselves an enormous favor by doing that. But I think beyond that, my observation is that mostly opportunity framing is done either in-house by big corporates, big oil and gas, for example, or is done and applied to clients by boutique consultancies. So people are very much protecting the intellectual property of framing as if it's some big secret. It's actually no big secret. It's out there. The real difference is not, oh, I've got this IP, you've got that IP. It's in the quality of the framing facilitators, as we've just described. I think a future trend we should try and enable is one whereby this goes into the public domain, that we get a public domain version of framing, and I haven't seen one yet, apart from, you know, copies of somebody's private one, private IP. Get one in the public domain, almost like freeware, that people can adapt and pick and apply, and then we can develop a community of framing facilitators, good ones, which I think we're lacking. And when I say we, I think the world is lacking. I mean, in my life, I could probably count on two hands the number of good framing facilitators I've ever met. Hundreds of pretenders, but a very, very few really good ones. And it's the really good ones that add enormous amounts of value to these projects. I think it's a skill that's insufficiently recognized. So I think, you know, getting it into the public domain and getting a pool of highly trained framing facilitation professionals out there available to the biggest and most complex projects, and not just for the big boys who can roll their own. I think that could be a future trend and something that we should try and enable.
Yeah, I love this, and I fully agree with you. You know, it's never just about the process. It's also, how do you use your facilitation skills? How do you develop those skills? And if you do, as an organization, build internal capabilities, I mean, just think about the impact that those framing skills could make on, you know, making the meetings more productive, right? Because those transferable skills can actually be utilized in so many different formats. So anyway, that was my last question, Karl. I know I could just sit with you and talk about framing, and maybe that's something we could think about doing on a regular basis. So anyway, I'm just throwing it out there. I just wanted to say thank you for your time, for sharing yourself, for your expertise. And I absolutely love learning from you every time we talk. I learn so much. So